The Crash and the Great Depression. Lecture terms. The Great Depression. Focus question. What were the causes of the Great Depression, and how effective were the government's responses by 1932? The 1928 election. Herbert Hoover seemed destined for a successful term as president when elected in 1928. The son of an Iowa blacksmith and a schoolteacher, Hoover ultimately made a fortune as a mining engineer in Asia, Africa, and Europe. He became famous for coordinating food relief in Europe during World War I. Hoover exemplified what was called the, quote, new era of American capitalism. In 1922, while he was Secretary of Commerce, Hoover published the book American Individualism. In this book, he condemned government regulation as an interference with the economic opportunities of ordinary Americans. Yet, he also argued that self-interest should be subordinated to public interest. Hoover thought himself a progressive, but he preferred what he termed associational action, in which private agencies directed regulatory and welfare policies, instead of the government intervening in the economy. When Coolidge declined to run for president again in 1928, Hoover won the Republican nomination, and he celebrated the era's prosperity and promised an end to poverty. He faced Alfred E. Smith, a Democrat and the first Catholic presidential nominee of a major party. Smith had been born into poverty on New York's Lower East Side. He eventually became a Tammany Hall politician, and although he was Irish, he emerged as the spokesman for the new immigrants coming into the United States. The Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York caused him to support progressive social legislation, and in his 3 terms as New York's governor, he secured laws limiting working hours for women and children. Smith denounced the Red Scare and called for Prohibition's repeal. The Democratic platform substantially differed from the Republicans, only on the issue of prohibition, though. Smith's Catholicism became the primary campaign issue and symbolized a cultural clash between native-born Protestant whites and the new immigrants. Although Hoover was elected by 58% of the vote, riding on the prosperity of the decade, Smith's campaign, which won the support of urban voters and farmers, ultimately laid the basis for the triumphant Democratic coalition that comes about in the 1930s with FDR. The Great Depression. On October 29, 1929, soon to be known as Black Tuesday, the stock market crashed. A panic ensued, and in 5 hours, $10 billion in the market value disappeared completely. The United States quickly found itself in what became known as the Great Depression, the greatest economic calamity in modern history. Signals of impending disaster were visible before October 1929. Southern California and Florida had experienced spectacular real estate booms and busts, which resulted in failed banks and foreclosed mortgages. The highly unequal distribution of income and persistent depression in farming areas reduced Americans' purchasing power and made them more willing to go into debt. Sales of new autos and household consumer goods stagnated, however, after 1926, and European demand for American goods also declined. A bursting of the stock market bubble that had been created in the 1920s by speculators was inevitable. But when it happened, it was so severe that it destroyed many investment companies altogether. This wiped out thousands of investors and squelched consumer confidence. Around 26,000 businesses failed in 1930 alone, and those that survived cut back on employment and investment. The financial system, which was based on the gold standard, could not effectively meet the downturn. This will have worldwide implications. Germany defaulted on its reparations payments to France and Great Britain, who in turn stopped repaying debts to the United States. Banks failed throughout the world as depositors withdrew money, and millions of families ultimately lost their life savings. Stocks briefly rebounded, but soon resumed their precipitous decline. In 1932, the economy hit rock bottom, with the GNP, or gross national product, down by a third. Prices were also down by 40%, and more than 11 million workers, which was 25% of the labor force, were now unemployed. Those who had jobs faced reduced wages and reduced hours. Every industrial economy suffered, but the United States was hit hardest. The Depression quickly transformed American lives, as hundreds of thousands took to the road to look for work, or stood in bread lines, and erected shack cities because they lost their homes. These shack cities were known as Hoovervilles, and the cities exhausted their poor relief. The Depression actually reversed the long-standing migration of Americans from farms to cities, as people tried to find land to grow food for their families. The suicide rate rose to its highest level in American history, and the birth rate dropped to its lowest. Also damaged was the public image of big business and Wall Street, which were shown to have thrived on the shady dealings, such as the sale of worthless bonds. Resignation and protest. Many Americans responded to the Great Depression with resignation, or they blamed themselves for their economic woes. Others responded with protests that were at first spontaneous and lacking in coordination, because the unions, socialist groups, and others that might have led them had been devastated in the 1920s. In early 1932, 20,000 unemployed World War I veterans who marched on Washington to demand early payment of a bonus due in 1945 because they were strapped for cash. They were dispersed by federal troops. Federal troops attacking veterans. Throughout America, demonstrations of the unemployed demanded work and relief. Farmers protested low prices by temporarily blocking roads to prevent goods from getting to market. The very small Communist Party in the United States was the only group that seemed able to channel and direct the discontent. Communists formed unemployed councils that organized marches, demonstrated for public assistance, and opposed evictions of unemployed families. The newspapers worried that America was close to revolution. To many Americans, President Hoover's response to the Depression seemed inadequate and lacking in compassion. His advisors told him that depressions were a normal function of capitalism, and this normal function ultimately removed uncompetitive firms and encouraged moral virtue among the unfortunate. Businessmen vehemently opposed federal assistance to the jobless, and many suggested that individuals would survive the Depression through thrift. Federal policymakers who had never faced an economic crisis of this magnitude did not realize the extent to which consumer spending supported much of the economy. Most did not believe that federal assistance to the unemployed would spur economic recovery. Hoover maintained his commitment to associational action. He was strongly opposed to direct federal economic intervention, and he believed that private charity and voluntary action by businesses to keep up investment and employment would suffice to end the Depression. He called together business and labor leaders and established commissions to encourage firms to coordinate maintaining prices and wages without the government actually demanding it or overseeing it. Needless to say, those businesses didn't want to do it and wouldn't if the government was not going to force them to. Hoover's public reassurances that the economy was recovering clashed with the reality and made him seem ignorant of the problems facing many ordinary Americans. He was out of touch. The economic outlook worsens. Some of Hoover's actions, such as the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which raised already high taxes on imported goods, caused other nations to retaliate and decreased international trade. This only exacerbated the crisis in the United States. A tax increase Hoover won from Congress in order to balance the budget further reduced consumers' purchasing power as well. By 1932, even Hoover conceded that voluntary measures were insufficient to have any real effect. He eventually signed laws creating Reconstruction Finance Corporation. This loaned money to failing banks, to failing railroads, and other businesses. He also signed a law creating the Federal Home Loan Bank System. This would give aid to homeowners threatened with foreclosure. Although he had vetoed bills to create employment with public works projects like road and bridge construction, he now approved $2 billion for such projects and local relief. But Hoover refused to do anything further, including direct aid to the unemployed, which, he told Congress, would be a, quote, disservice to the jobless. In the mid-1920s, some intellectuals had worried that the prevailing notion of freedom in America celebrated unbound economic enterprise, yet accepted limits on free speech and expression and other civil liberties. Though the prosperity of the 1920s reinforced this laissez-faire conception of freedom, the Great Depression and Hoover's failed response to discredit it proved otherwise. By 1932, the basis for a new conception of freedom based on progressive-style, positive state action in the economy, government regulation, as well as a respect for civil liberties and cultural pluralism, was already present and would become the foundation of modern 20th century liberalism.